Hey guys, welcome. Go ahead and get comfortable, maybe dim the lights. Tonight, we're going to float down the Nile, back to a time of pyramids, pharaohs and, well, questionable snack choices. We're going to talk about what ancient Egyptians ate when they wanted a little something extra, what they reached for after a long day of, building eternity. We have this image of ancient Egypt as this grand, monolithic, serious place. All gold masks and solemn gods with animal heads. But these were real people. They got tired, they got bored, and they definitely got hungry for something other than sensible lentil stew. So settle in, close your eyes if you want to, and let's drift back and explore the very relatable world of ancient Egyptian junk food. To understand their junk food, you first have to understand their food, the absolute bedrock of their entire society, the thing that fueled everyone from the pharaoh down to the guy hauling limestone blocks, was bread and beer. Lots and lots of bread and beer. They were often made in the same place, a sort of one-stop carb shop, because the yeast for the bread was also used for the beer. Efficient. Bread was life. It was so central that the standard greeting wasn't hello, but a phrase that roughly translates to bread and beer. It was a wish for your prosperity, for you to be well fed. Bread was even used as currency to pay workers. The teams who built the Great Pyramid at Giza, for instance, were estimated to have been fed daily rations that included beef. But the real fuel was the endless supply of bread. Now, when we say bread, don't picture a light, fluffy sourdough loaf. The most common type of bread was a dense, coarse flatbread made from a type of wheat called emmer. To make the flour, they ground the grain by hand between two stones called querns, and no matter how careful they were, little bits of sand and grit from the grinding stones always ended up in the flour. Just imagine that for a moment. Every single bite of your daily bread for your entire life had sand in it. Archaeologists can see the results of this on the teeth of mummies. Their teeth are often worn right down to the nub, a testament to a lifetime of grinding away on gritty bread. So your average Egyptian's daily bread was less of a treat and more of a dental challenge. It was dense, it was sandy, and it was the blank canvas upon which the masterpiece of Egyptian cuisine was painted, or sketched at least. They did try to liven it up, of course. For those who could afford it, there were finer dessert breads and cakes made from higher grade flour. They might shape the loaves like people, or animals, or fish, because nothing says delicious like a loaf of bread staring back at you with the vacant eyes of a baked fish. Flavorings like coriander seeds and dates were sometimes added, but again, that was more for the upper crust. The average person's bread was plain, functional, and gritty. And what do you wash down your sandy bread with? Why, beer, of course. Ancient Egyptian beer was not the crisp, clear lager we know today. It was thick, nutritious, and probably had the consistency of a thin porridge or gruel. It was a staple of the diet for everyone, including children. It was made by taking barley, sometimes mixed with emmer wheat, and making a sort of beer bread. This bread was lightly baked, so the yeast inside wasn't killed. It was then crumbled, washed with water in a large vat and left to ferment. The result was a cloudy, starchy beverage that was a major source of calories and nutrients. They didn't really filter it, so you were getting a lot of the grain solids. Some tomb paintings even show people drinking this beer through long straws, possibly to get past the layer of chaff and bits floating on the top. Classy. The alcohol content could actually be quite high, maybe around 10%, so it was definitely potent. They even gave their different brews poetic names like the Joy Bringer or the Heavenly. So while it was a food source, it was also very much a source of relaxation after a long day of chewing sand. So you have your two main food groups accounted for, gritty bread and soupy beer. What about when you wanted something else? This is where we start to venture into the territory of snacks and treats, the ancient equivalent of reaching into the pantry for a bag of chips. For the average Egyptian, a quick, easy snack would have been something grown locally that required no preparation. Things like green onions, garlic, radishes, and cucumbers were common. They'd just eat them raw. Imagine that. Your go-to snack is a raw onion. It certainly keeps people at a distance. More appealingly, they had access to a lot of fruit. Dates and figs were everywhere and incredibly common. They were high in sugar and protein, making them the perfect natural energy bar. Grapes, melons, and certain types of berries were also enjoyed when in season. Dates, in particular, were the workhorse of the Egyptian sweet tooth. Since sugarcane wasn't available yet, the main sweeteners were honey and dates. Honey was expensive, a luxury for the rich, but dates were plentiful. For the poor, dates were their sugar. They could be eaten fresh or dried for long-term storage, providing a quick hit of sweetness any time. Now let's move from the healthy, sensible snacks to the more processed options. The ancient Egyptians were, it seems, the inventors of deep frying. Depictions found in tombs dating back to around 1450 BC show people frying what appeared to be cakes in pans of fat. So the universal comfort of fried dough is not a modern invention. It is an ancient, time-honored tradition. What were they frying? Well, one of the most well-documented treats is something called a tiger nut cake. Now, a tiger nut isn't a nut at all. It's the small, wrinkly tuber of a sedge plant, a little root that happens to have a sweet, nutty taste. These things were beloved. They were eaten raw, boiled in barley drinks to sweeten them, or ground into a flour to make sweets. The recipe for these tiger nut sweets was considered so good that one high-ranking official, a vizier named Rekmire, had the entire process painted on the walls of his tomb. He apparently wanted to make sure he'd have an eternal supply in the afterlife. That's how you know it's good junk food, when you're willing to dedicate valuable tomb real estate to the recipe. The process, as shown in the paintings, involved grinding the tiger nuts into flour. This flour was then mixed with honey into a pliable dough. Sometimes a little fat would be added. The dough was then shaped into tall, conical loaves, almost like little pyramids of sweetness, and then fried. In some variations, it seems they might have also prepared a syrup of dates and honey to pour over the finished product, just in case it wasn't quite sweet enough. The texture of these cakes was probably a bit coarse and crumbly from the tiger nut flour, held together by the sticky honey and fat. Think of it as a sort of ancient fried energy bite. It's sweet, it's fatty, it's carb heavy. It checks all the junk food boxes, and it was popular enough to be a cherished treat for the living and a necessary provision for the dead. You can find modern recipes online that try to replicate these, often substituting ground almonds or walnuts for the tiger nuts, which are a bit harder to come by these days. But the core idea remains: a sticky paste of something sweet, mixed with a binder and fried. Beyond these specific cakes, Egyptians made other types of fried pastries. They would make simple doughs of flour and water, sometimes with a little yeast, roll them out thin, fold them into squares, and fry them in hot oil until reddish brown. Once out of the oil, they'd be sprinkled with powdered sugar, or rather, the ancient equivalent, which would probably be more honey or date sugar. Dumplings made from a fermented dough and dropped as little balls into hot oil were also common. So the street food scene in a place like Thebes or Memphis might have included a vendor selling these hot, fried doughs. A worker, paid in bread, might trade a small loaf for a handful of honey-drizzled, fried tiger nut cakes. It was the quick, cheap, satisfying hit of fat and sugar that people have always craved. It wasn't just sweets they were frying. Fish, which was a major source of protein for all but the poorest Egyptians, was often preserved. Even the wealthy, who had access to a much wider variety of foods, were not immune to the call of rich, fatty goodness. In fact, they perfected a delicacy that is still controversial today: foie gras. Tomb paintings from as far back as 2500 BC show scenes of workers cramming food down the throats of geese and ducks to fatten up their livers. This technique, called gavauge, was an Egyptian invention. So the ultimate luxury junk food, a rich and fatty liver, was being produced and consumed along the Nile millennia ago. And of course, they had other meats. While beef was often reserved for the elite or special occasions, mutton and pork were more common. The Greek historian Herodotus claimed that Egyptians considered pigs to be unclean, but archaeological evidence tells a different story. Pig bones are found quite regularly at settlement sites, suggesting that pork was definitely on the menu, especially for the common people. And how did they cook it? Boiling, stewing, roasting, and yes, frying. Animal fat was a common cooking medium, so a nice, crispy piece of fried pork belly was not out of the question. They even ate some more adventurous proteins. Hedgehogs, for instance. A common way to cook a hedgehog was to encase it in clay and bake it. When the hardened clay was cracked open, the prickly spines would be pulled away with it, leaving the cooked meat behind. It sounds like a lot of work for a small meal, but it was apparently a known dish. Perhaps a baked hedgehog was the original TV dinner. Just crack and eat. The picture that emerges is one of a diet that, at its core, was incredibly carb-heavy. For the vast majority of people, life was a cycle of bread and beer, supplemented with vegetables, legumes, and a bit of fish. This diet, which modern nutritionists might even praise for being largely plant-based, actually had some serious downsides. The grit in the bread destroyed their teeth, and the sheer volume of carbohydrates, combined with the beer, meant that obesity was a real problem, especially among the elite who didn't have to perform manual labor. Studies of mummies have shown that many members of the upper class were overweight and suffered from clogged arteries and heart disease. They were eating a diet of whole grains, fruits, and vegetables, and yet they were facing the same health problems we do today. It turns out that a diet of bread, beer, and honey-fried cakes isn't the key to eternal health. Who knew? But for a moment, let's not worry about their arteries. Let's just picture the end of a day in ancient Deir el-Medina, the village where the tomb builders lived. The sun is setting over the Valley of the Kings. The dust of the day is settling. A man sits on a reed mat outside his small house. He's tired. His teeth hurt. He unwraps a small package and pulls out a still warm, sticky, conical cake made of tiger nuts and honey. It's sweet, it's rich, and for a few minutes, it's a little piece of joy. A little escape from the daily grind. And that, really, is what junk food has always been about. Let's just rest here for a bit, in the quiet of that Egyptian evening, before we float over to another corner of their ancient pantry. There's still more to see, more strange snacks and questionable banquet foods to uncover. So just relax. Let the sounds of the Nile drift by. We'll continue our journey in a moment. Alright, let's talk about parties. Because if you really want to see a culture's junk food shine, you have to look at how they celebrate. Egyptian banquets, at least for the wealthy, were elaborate affairs. They usually started in the afternoon. Men and women were seated separately unless they were married, and your seat depended on your social status. The highest ranking guests got chairs, the next level got stools, and the lowest in rank just sat on the floor. A bit awkward, but you knew where you stood, or sat. Before the food even came out, servants would come around with basins of water for washing hands, and they would burn aromatics, little cones of scented fat, to make the air smell nice. Or maybe to cover up the smell of 100 undeodorized guests in the Egyptian heat. And the food was abundant. We're talking whole roasted oxen, ducks, geese, pigeons, and all kinds of fish. There were heaps of fresh vegetables and fruits, and endless amounts of bread and stews. And of course, huge quantities of alcohol. Wine was more of a luxury than beer, but at a banquet, it flowed freely. One tomb inscription has a guest pleading, "Give me 18 cups of wine because I want to drink until drunkenness. My insides are like straw." A relatable sentiment, if ever there was one. Amidst all this extravagant food, you'd find the desserts, the grand finale. We've already talked about the cakes baked with dates and sweetened with honey. These would be present in many forms, likely richer and made with finer flour than the everyday versions. There would be plates of fresh figs and dates, pomegranates and grapes. But they also had other confections. A type of pastry which some consider an ancestor of baklava, was made with layers of dough and nuts, all soaked in honey syrup. They also made a sort of candy by mixing milk, butter, and honey and cooking it down into a ball. Mashed dates and grated coconuts were then mixed in, and the whole thing was kneaded and shaped into a loaf. Once cooled, it could be sliced. Imagine a dense, sweet date and coconut fudge. That was the kind of thing you'd find on a pharaoh's dessert tray. Another interesting treat involved cheese. Cheese was a part of their diet, and archaeologists have found remnants of it in tombs. It was likely a simple, fresh cheese, similar to cottage cheese or quark, and at festivals it was often served with desserts. So you might have a honey-drenched pastry served alongside a scoop of fresh, slightly salty cheese. A flavor combination that still works today. Let's consider the more common folk. They weren't having lavish banquets with whole roasted oxen, but they had festivals and celebrations, and they had their own special foods for those times. A popular street food, which is still a staple in Egypt today, is fulmedams. This is a dish of slow-cooked fava beans, mashed and seasoned with garlic, olive oil, and other spices. It's believed to have ancient origins. A worker might buy a scoop of this hearty, savory paste served in a piece of flatbread. It's cheap, it's filling, and is deeply satisfying. It's the kind of comfort food that becomes a national dish. Then there's the ancestor of falafel, known in Egypt as ta'amea. Instead of chickpeas, the Egyptian version is traditionally made with dried fava beans. The beans are crushed, mixed with herbs like parsley and dill, formed into patties and deep fried. Crispy on the outside, soft and green on the inside. This is another food with ancient roots, thought to have possibly been developed by Coptic Christians as a meal for fasting periods. It was, and still is a perfect street food. Easy to make, easy to sell, and delicious. So you have these savory fried treats, and you have your sweet fried treats. But what about a snack that was just weird? The Egyptians ate lettuce, a lot of it, but it wasn't the crisp iceberg or romaine we know. It was a type of wild lettuce, and it had a strange double meaning. It was eaten as a food, of course, often just raw as a side dish, but it was also considered a powerful aphrodisiac and was associated with Min, the god of fertility. This was because the plant, when cut, would exude a milky white liquid, which, well, you can probably guess the connection they made. So a simple salad in ancient Egypt might have had some performance-enhancing expectations attached to it. Not exactly your typical junk food, but certainly a food with a purpose beyond simple nutrition. Let's float back to the sweets for a moment. What did the kids eat? While we don't have specific records of child-focused snacks, we can assume they ate smaller versions. And what about a cold treat on a hot day? There was no refrigeration, no ice cream, but they could create cooling drinks. Fruit juices, especially from grapes and dune palm nuts, were popular. They could also make a kind of sweet, milky drink. And they had a form of rice pudding. Rice was available, and a simple pudding of rice cooked with milk and sweetened with honey would have been a comforting, cooling dessert, always served cold. So let's take a step back and look at the overall landscape of Egyptian junk food. You have a foundational diet of gritty bread and thick beer. Your healthy snacks are raw vegetables and sugar-rich fruits. Your indulgent snacks are almost all fried. Fried dough, fried cakes, fried fava bean patties. Your sweeteners are honey and dates. Your luxury items are fatty goose liver and copious amounts of wine. It's a diet that feels both alien and deeply familiar. The ingredients are different, but the cravings are the same. The desire for something sweet, something salty, something fatty, something fried, that's universal. The Egyptian worker reaching for a honey cake is not so different from us reaching for a donut. The nobleman enjoying a rich, fatty liver is just indulging in the same way a modern gourmand might.